Okay, thanks Alok and thanks Peter. So the first question which I would like to ask is that in the first part when you were talking with Alok, you have mentioned that in United States when you were protesting against Modi and you were mishandled by people who belong to some foreign affiliation of RSS, for example, HSS. And so it is well established that this Sangh Parivar or RSS Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, it is well established in United States and other parts of Western world. So how deep is this infiltration in your opinion?
Well, the HSS, which is the international wing of the RSS, was established in, I believe, the end of 1947 or 1948 by a RSS member who left India and moved to Kenya.
Yeah.
And from there, he established this first branch of the international wing of the RSS, which he named the HSS, or Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, and then began expanding out from there. They established a branch in UK, and subsequently later in the 1970s established a branch in the US. So there's a branch in the US of the HSS, which was established in the 1970s, now has hundreds, I believe, approximately 150 shakas or branches throughout the US. It has thousands of members. And this is not the only organization of the Sangh Parivar which is established abroad. There's also other organizations such as the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or VHP, which in America is known as the VHP of America. And the VHP is the religious wing of the RSS. There's also notably the Overseas Friends of the BJP, or OFBJP, which is the international wing of the BJP. And I would say that they're very well established in the US, as well as in many countries in Europe and even in Africa. The OFBJP, for instance, boasts some dozens of chapters. I believe they've at one point boasted a good 45 chapters around the world in different countries. The HSS has presence in dozens of countries around the world, but most notably in countries like the US, Canada, the UK, and then in a number of countries throughout continental Europe.
Yeah, so just staying at HSS, HSS is also present in Germany, and they have various chapters in different cities of Germany, for example, Frankfurt or Munich. And on their website, if you go, they claim that they are in no way linked to RSS, except that they are ideologically inspired by RSS. And why do you think that they have to mention this? I mean, do you think that it is because they want to portray a clear or a clean image or something like that, or what's the intention? Because of this, sometimes what happens is many of the politicians in the West who are not so aware about this connection, they also end up attending these events which HSS organizes, and then this in the end gives them legitimacy.
Yes. And as you mentioned, and that's one of the goals of the HSS abroad, is to pursue legitimacy for the HSS, but ultimately for the RSS itself. Mm-hmm. Now, the HSS is the RSS. Most of the members, most of the top executives in these organizations are actually former members of the RSS from India who emigrated abroad. The HSS openly declares that it is ideologically aligned with the RSS. The HSS, at most of their events, their formal HSS events, you'll find them displaying the same pictures that you find displayed at RSS events in India, namely a picture of Hedgavar, KB Hedgavar,
yeah,
who was the first chief of the RSS, as well as a picture of MS Golvarkar, who was the second and longest serving chief of the RSS. And you will invariably find these pictures both at RSS events in India and HSS events abroad. The HSS routinely hosts RSS executives on tours of the countries in which they're based. In the U.S., for instance, there's been incidents where an RSS executive, a top leader in the RSS in India, is brought to the U.S. and then he tours around half a dozen or a dozen different cities in the U.S., going from HSS branch to HSS branch. The HSS is the RSS.
Okay, and so they have different organizations in different countries or different parts of the world. HSS, VHP, Overseas Friends of BJP, as you mentioned. But in India, the objective is clear because they are a fascist organization, and they intend to make India a Hindu Rashtra, basically a place which is dominated by Hindus. But what do you, in your opinion, what do they hope to achieve when they are having this presence in Western side of the world, for example, in United States or in England, in Germany, in many such countries?
Well, anywhere they're present, whether it's Germany, England, US, Canada, Australia, I would say they generally have the same goals. And they have a couple of major goals. One is, and actually, if you look at the words of the former head of the Foreign Affairs Cell chief of the BJP, who is in charge of the OFBJP, in, I believe, 2015 or 2016, he said that the goal of the OFBJP is to, quote unquote, indoctrinate the diaspora into BJP ideology. So one of their goals is that Indian diaspora abroad, whether it's in America or Europe or whatever country, one of the goals of the OFBJP and these RSS groups abroad is to indoctrinate and is to indoctrinate as many members of the diaspora into this Hindutva RSS ideology as possible. Now, why do they want to do that? One of the major reasons that they want to do that is because, well, two reasons. One is that the BJP in India benefits from that. Specifically, the OFBJP, which draws most of its membership and its activists from the HSS, the VHP, these other Sangh Parivar groups. The OFBJP abroad is used to assist the election of the BJP in India. What you have is thousands of members of the OFBJP who are not citizens of India, who many of whom have emigrated from India and have given up their Indian citizenship to acquire citizenship in the West, but who are still ideologically aligned with the BJP and RSS, and who use their power, their wealth, their influence in the countries where they've moved in order to work to get the BJP elected in India. In 2014, they were highly influential in helping Modi to come to power as prime minister. From the US, from Canada, from Europe, there were thousands and thousands of OFBJP activists who were mobilized to literally travel from those countries to India to serve as boots on the ground, as campaign workers for the BJP. You had people who didn't go, but who organized phone banks, telethons, this sort of thing for months on end to call up relatives, friends of friends, anybody that they could contact back in India and tell them to vote for the BJP. So that's one thing that they achieve, one way in which they benefit by having this presence abroad. Another way that they benefit and in which they're used is in assisting the public image of India, specifically India under the BJP RSS regime. In the home countries where they've taken up residence, they routinely stage protests in favor of RSS BJP issues. They routinely meet with politicians and they attempt to secure support from those politicians in such a way that their policies in office will be pro-India under an RSS regime but pro-India without conditions, and thus without the condition of, for instance, pro-India as long as India is supporting human rights. They also are involved in relation to that. They're also involved in seeking out candidates for office to support, to prop up, in order to get them into office for the same reason, so that they can carry water for the RSS BJP agenda from abroad by attempting to sabotage or derail any attempts by various countries to hold RSS, BJP, Modi accountable for human rights violations, and so forth.
This Indian diaspora, which has migrated outside India to America or to Europe, they enjoy a very good standard of living. They have immigrated basically for that reason, that they have better opportunities outside, so they have immigrated. They have better human rights outside. These are allowed. They have freedom of speech. They have every kind of freedom, and they seem to support that in Western world. And yet, having enjoyed all these things and supporting a kind of fascism or a Hindu nationalistic narrative back in home, where you do not talk about development, you do not talk about human rights or social justice, but you talk about majoritarianism. How do you see this kind of a paradox, or is it a paradox or is it a hypocrisy? What do you think of it?
Well, it certainly appears to be a major disconnect that one would expect would inspire a lot of cognitive dissonance in the people that are engaging in this type of an action. Mm-hmm. Now, is it a paradox or is it intentional? That's a good question. Whatever the case is, what happens is that you have a number of people who are RSS BJP supporters, members, who do emigrate to these countries, take up residence, and then dedicate themselves. And when I say dedicate themselves, I really mean dedicate themselves. For many of these people, this is their primary passion in life. Dedicate themselves to building up and assisting the rise to power of the BJP RSS in India. Why do they do it? Well, one could argue that because they are coming to these countries, that there's greater opportunities for acquiring wealth. There's a long-standing tradition of protected democracy and democratic rights. There's an appreciation for multiculturalism and for diversity, that actually provides them with an ability to gain greater stability and standing so that they can work towards their goal of upholding, advancing majoritarianism and supremacism in India.
This kind of, again, paradox that you are going to the West and using those means to achieve wealth and to achieve power, and then suppressing the same human rights and same kind of democratic rights back in your home.
Many of these people, RSS BJP promoters, they're taking advantage of the freedom that's to be found in these countries that they've settled in order to work to take away the freedom of Indians.
Yeah, exactly. And in your opinion, how dangerous could this infiltration or this kind of behavior be for Western democracies?
Well, it's certainly extremely dangerous for Indians. You know, if nothing else, if I were an Indian, if I were a citizen of India living in the country, I would be shocked, terrified, and infuriated that so many people who have chosen to leave the country, to abandon the country, and take up residence somewhere else for a better life, and renounce their citizenship, are so deeply involved in influencing and twisting Indian democracy. And I would be raising my voice in the streets, demanding that something must change, that some kind of legal change must be implemented, if nothing else, to prevent this sort of activity from occurring. That the supporters of the BJP, who are not citizens of India, should have no role whatsoever to play in the democratic elections in India. So, but as far as how dangerous is it for Western democracies? Well, that's a good question, and we can only speculate. So, certainly, as these groups have assisted the rise of majoritarianism, supremacism, fascism in India, um, what is happening in India will become a concern for the West, as India, as now becoming really an overtly fascist country, has a huge amount of power, increasing influence. They're becoming not necessarily a superpower, but they're becoming one of the largest, most powerful, most influential countries in the world. And the potential for the security of Western democracy or democracy in any country, West or East, when this is the case in India, when it's such a large country with so much influence and power, has become overtly fascist, the potential for damage to democracy anywhere else in the world begins to increase. As far as how that would impact the democratic rights or the process of democracy, freedom, liberty for people that are living in these democracies abroad, in the West, in Europe, in the US, that's an open question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but we have seen that, and you have written so many articles about the same thing, that, for example, Tulsi Gabbard and other such politicians have been supported overtly by RSS and overseas friends of BJP. Is that also a dangerous trend, that some other countries trying to influence the elections in another country, while both of the democracies are like sovereign democracies, and yet this influence, is it harmful?
Yeah, for instance, we saw during the presidential elections here in the US, we saw Senator Bernie Sanders in February, I believe. He issued a statement, a tweet, in which he referred to this anti-Muslim pogrom that occurred in New Delhi in February. And he referred to how President Trump has displayed a failure of leadership in his neglect, his refusal to speak on this issue, to take a stance on this issue. In response, this gentleman, B.L. Santosh, who is, I believe, the second most powerful man in the BJP currently, he's a national general secretary of the BJP, he issued a response to Senator Sanders in which he very directly said that that although they wish to be neutral in the presidential elections in the U.S., now they have no choice but to take action, be it be an influence in the elections, interfere in the elections, basically. When we saw national elections in the UK before Boris Johnson came to power as prime minister, we saw developing controversy there as members of the BJP, members of the RSS, were specifically targeting candidates, not just Indian candidates, but other non-Indian candidates, targeting them to try and remove them from office because of their stance on human rights in India. We've also seen over the past couple of months here in the US, we've seen some of the major figures in these RSS, HSS, OFBJP groups in America. We've seen them providing targeted funding in particular to the challenger of Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib is one of the first female Muslims elected to the US Congress. In the past couple of months, we've seen these RSS groups in the US providing targeted funding to attempt to remove her from office because it appears of her affiliation as being one of the first Muslim women in office in Congress, as well as because of her stance on human rights in India. So we see a number of, very recently, and this has been the case over years as well, we see a number of instances where these groups abroad are operating to interfere or threatening to interfere in elections in these Western democracies in order to get their candidates into office or in order to prevent a candidate from being in office who they find distasteful because this person has stood up for human rights in India.
Mm-hmm. And in the part where you were having conversation with Alok, you mentioned that RSS has been involved in so many countless acts of violence, right, starting from independence after that, and then right up to recently these Delhi riots, which happened in February 2020. They have been involved in so many acts of violence, and all their subsidiaries have also been involved in so many acts of violence. For example, VHP and Bajrang Dal. And the founders of RSS were even admirers of Hitler, and even CIA has listed VHP and Bajrang Dal, these two organizations, as militant organization, and yet VHP continues to be present in so many countries. Why is it allowed?
Well, certainly what you referred to earlier about how the HSS makes this distinction and says that it adheres to RSS ideology, but it's not the RSS. Certainly that's one aspect of it. The VHP in America, for instance, is a separate entity. It's very closely tied in with the VHP in India. It routinely hosts a VHP of India executive leaders, and it's to a large extent it appears to be controlled and influenced in its agenda by the VHP of India, but it is legally a separate entity. So that's one aspect of it. I would say that another aspect, as far as why there's this failure to take action, why these groups are able to operate with impunity, is that there's a general ignorance in the West, for no fault of anybody, but there's a general ignorance in the West about the significance of these groups in particular. We've seen a rising awareness, especially over the past couple of years, about the issue of Hindu nationalism. There is beginning to be a rising concern about the policies of Modi and about the actions that he and his regime have taken in Kashmir especially. But there's really a widespread lack of knowledge that these policies, these actions, are instigated by their core aspects of the agenda of the RSS. And the reason that they're taking place, the reason these policies are being implemented, is because that is the agenda of the RSS. The nature of the RSS, the extent of its power in India, such issues as the fact that the RSS constitutes 3/4 of India's union cabinet, such issues as the fact that Modi himself was groomed by the RSS since he was a child. These things are not widely known in the West, and so that really it leads, I think, to a tendency to take seriously the presence of the RSS abroad.
Yeah, but still, the VHP is classified by CIA as a militant organization, and when you have a VHP, say VHP America, which is separate legal entity, but they are de facto the same entities. But is it just the legalities which is protecting them in America, or is it? How is it not visible? Or
the short answer is I don't know. A little bit longer of an answer is that I would say this chief of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, he was implicated in the mid-2000s, in I believe 2007, 2008. He was implicated in signing off, approving of a series of anti-Muslim terrorist bombings that were conducted by this man, Swami Asimanand, who is an RSS member. And yet, fast forward to 2018. In 2018, you had in Chicago, you had this conference, which was organized by the VHP of America, and the organization was particularly conducted not by the VHP of America, although they were the host organization, but by a secretary of the VHP of India, who has a track record of making very militant statements. And then at this conference, which is organized by the VHP, the keynote speaker was RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat himself, who just a few years earlier, just 10 years earlier, had been implicated in signing off on this series of anti-Muslim terrorist bombings in India. Now, why is he allowed into the country? Why is this VHP secretary, who has a track record of making militant statements in favor of attacking minorities, why is he allowed into the country? Why, it's one thing for these entities like HSS or VHP of America, or VHP of whichever country you're talking about, for these entities which are legally separate, it's one thing for them to be operating freely. But for then these members of RSS or these members of VHP, which, as you've said, has been declared as a religious militant organization by the CIA, why are they allowed to freely come into the country? And that's a good question. I don't have an answer to that, but that is an issue that demands consideration.
And have you tried to approach the authorities in the United States, the lawmakers, or anybody who can take notice of this?
Absolutely. I'm in process of that currently. I've done that in the past. And a great deal of the work that I do is seeking to engage with political leadership and draw their attention to this issue and arouse their sense of concern about this issue.
Okay, and what is the general reaction from the other side when you try to approach these people? Are they already aware, or are they shocked, or how is the reaction generally?
I think that it's a new issue for most elected officials in these countries, in my country certainly, in Europe as well. I think that it's an issue that they're not generally familiar with at all. And so because of that, it can take a little bit more work initially in order to properly inform them, properly educate them. As I've heard, for instance, about this parliamentarian, I believe Sana Kurtz in Munich, who had been invited to one of these HSS events. And once this was discovered that she was invited and was going to be speaking, she was approached by concerned citizens, and they informed her of what the HSS is, what the RSS is. And once she learned, she very quickly backed out.
Yeah.
But as I understand from that issue, prior to being informed about the RSS and HSS, she had no knowledge. And I think that that's typically what you find throughout most of these, especially these Western democracies, is very few people have even a basic fundamental grasp on the nature or the significance of the Sangh Parivar, the RSS, the HSS, and these groups. Once, if they're willing to listen, which most are, if they're informed about it, most very quickly, I would say, are quite eager to disassociate at the least, and some even eager to do more than that and take up the baton and step forward and actually take a stance against the Sangh Parivar, which is what one would hope for. But there's a real need for education.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just one more question. What do you think about the ambassador from Germany in India visiting the headquarters of RSS in Nagpur? How do you see that event?
So last year, Ambassador Walter Lindner visited the RSS headquarters in Nagpur.
Yes.
And when he did it, a couple of things. One is that while he was meeting this RSS chief, Mohan Bhagwat, who, as we just discussed, is implicated in signing off on terrorist bombings 10 years ago. When Lindner was meeting Mohan Bhagwat in the office, he was pictured in a picture where on the back wall, there was a photo of M.S. Golvarkar. M.S. Golvarkar is the second and longest serving leader of the RSS, the most influential leader of the RSS. He's known as the guru of the RSS. He headed the group for 33 years. Now, M.S. Golvarkar is also notorious for basically his manifestos, in which, among other things, he spoke about Nazi Germany in 1930s, 1939 specifically, when his first manifesto was written. And he referred to the policy of the Nazis of purging, in his words, of purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. And he affirmed it and upheld it as a good example of how multiculturalism is a bad idea and is unworkable. And then went on to further affirm it as being a good lesson for us in India to learn and profit by, essentially praising the racial policies of the Nazis. And that's just a one-off, that's just a single example of multiple examples of Golvarkar and other affiliated ideologues of the RSS, specifically praising the policies, the anti-Jewish policies that led to the Holocaust of the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, Lindner, first, he was pictured here at the headquarters, speaking with the chief of the RSS, while this picture of this Golvarkar who praised Nazi racial policies is on the wall in the background. Subsequently, he was pictured going to a site at the headquarters where there is a statue of Hedgevar, the first chief of the RSS. And he was pictured laying flowers at the feet of the statue of Hedgevar, which for anybody that has basic familiarity with Indian culture, touching the feet is considered to be a sign of deference, honoring the person, a sign of great respect, a sign of submission, a sign of, many of these different things. It was, when you combine that action of the Ambassador Lindner, basically paying obeisance to the statue of the first chief of the RSS, while speaking with while also earlier speaking with the current chief of the RSS, with a picture of RSS chief who praised Nazi racial policy on the wall in the background. When you take all that into context, it came across as really an affirmation of the RSS. It came across as a sign of approval, recognition, legitimization of the RSS.
But if you see the statement by Ambassador, he clarified later on that there are always two sides of anything. And then I have always heard either very bad things about RSS or either very good things about RSS. And I just wanted to make my own opinion. What do you think of that statement?
Well, I would say, for one thing, if you speak to RSS people, you will certainly hear very many good things about the RSS. So it really depends on who you talk to. For another thing, I would say that argument might hold water. It might be convincing to me if the ambassador had not actually gone to the statue of Hedgevar, of this first chief of the RSS, and laid flowers at the feet. Once he did that, I refuse to believe that he was simply visiting the headquarters to see for himself what was happening there, because once he did that, that was a sign, and he's deeply immersed. He's actually, with great respect to him for doing it, he has deeply immersed himself in Indian culture. He is very aware of Indian culture. He himself would know that taking that action of laying flowers at the feet of this chief of the RSS, of his statue, was a sign of obeisance. So once he did that, I completely reject his argument that he was just there to check out and see the RSS for himself.
Yeah, that, and the fact that later on he should have clarified that what opinion he made afterwards. Once he has seen both sides, now he should make an opinion, and he has not said that. Anyway, thank you very much, Peter. And are you planning anytime soon to go to India? I mean,
I would love to return to India tomorrow. The times that I've been to India have been some of my favorite in my life. I am fascinated by Indian history. I love the culture there. I love the topography there. I love the food, and I love the people. Yeah. But I have a number of Indians themselves telling me, Peter, don't come to India right now. It's not safe.
Okay, thanks a lot.